Hello, I'm Tom Hobbs. I'm a professor emeritus in the Department of Ecosystem Science and Sustainability at Colorado State University, and I'm a senior research scientist at the Natural Resource Ecology Laboratory. The topic of this video is a series of tools and methods in the Bayesian framework that I have found to be exceptionally useful in my own work. They're useful because they enable me to bring together hard-won published data, as well as data that have been collected at multiple times and in many different places, to bring those together to bear on important ecological questions and to gain new insight about the operation of ecological processes. I want to start out by gratefully acknowledging the support that I've received from the National Science Foundation through an opportunity for promoting understanding through synthesis, an Opus Award from the Population and Community Ecology Cluster in the Division of Environmental Biology at the National Science Foundation. That support is what has enabled me to produce these videos. Let me start out with a very au courant idea that great new insight is going to emerge from big data in ecology, from the many inventory and monitoring networks that exist in the Forest Service and the Soil Conservation Service and so on, as well as, of course, the National Ecological Observatory Network. We are these days seeing data at multiple scales and collected over time periods that heretofore we've never seen before. And there's a lot of interest in using these new enormous data sets to gain new insight in ecology. But I would argue that there's already a lot of big data that are not being used. These big data are what have already been published, what are in peer-reviewed literature. And I illustrate that with this slide, which includes the results from a very simple search in Web of Science. I simply searched on the keyword ecol star in the publication title field, and this yielded more than 100,000 papers. There's tremendous understanding, question-driven, theoretically motivated understanding in this type of big data. And it's the purpose of this series of lectures in these next few videos is to get you started in how you would use this existing published data. So the overarching objective of the videos is to learn Bayesian methods for synthesizing existing ecological data and published findings to gain new insight. There are a set of prerequisites. These, if you don't have most of these, then the videos are probably not going to be terribly useful for you. You need a basic understanding of Bayesian inference, including how Bayes' theorem is derived. You need some familiarity with the basic common statistical distributions, particularly the normal, log normal, the beta distribution, the gamma, the Poisson, and the negative binomial. You need to understand directed acyclic graphs and their relationship to the factored joint distribution. You should be able to write expressions for the posterior distribution and the fully factored joint distributions in proper statistical notation. You should have a fundamental sort of high level, at least, understanding of the essential features of Markov chain Monte Carlo or other algorithms for sampling from marginal posterior distributions. And it will be helpful if you have some familiarity with basic syntax of coding languages for implementing Markov chain Monte Carlo in JAGS, OpenBugs, or STAN. Here's just a little bit of housekeeping to get us started. There are materials that accompany these videos on a GitHub site. There's slides for each of the videos. So essentially what I'm showing you on the screen now, right now, are available as PDFs. There's a step-by-step answered exercise illustrating a hierarchical Bayesian model for synthesizing data from multiple studies. We'll get to that in the last of these 4 videos. And then there's a distribution cheat sheet, which is a sort of a summary of the major statistical distributions. And importantly, it has formulas for moment matching, which we will cover in the next video. So here's the URL. I'll linger here a bit for you to perhaps write that down, because the materials in this GitHub site will be very useful to you. So here's the topics, 4 videos. This video is going to review the components of Bayesian inference, the components of Bayes' theorem. We'll talk a little bit about why we would want to use priors that are informed or informative. And then will you do a problem present a problem that uses published means and standard deviations. The solution to that problem will be offered in the next video, which is called moment matching, which is a technique that's rarely taught in textbooks, but turns out to be fundamental to using published studies to develop new priors for the work that you're doing right now. Then in video 3, it should be video 3 there, I'll show you how to develop priors using moment matching from multiple studies. And then in video 4, we'll do hierarchical analysis of data sets from multiple studies where we actually have the data, not just the published statistics, but we have the data in hand. Just a little bit of review of notation because it's somewhat diverse in statistics. I'll always refer to data as Y. Theta or other Greek symbols, Greek letters will be referred to parameters. Bracket Y, vertical bar, theta bracket is popular notation these days to mean the probability or probability density of Y conditional on theta. So for example, Y conditional on theta might equal normal for the random variable Y with parameters mu of the normal distribution and variance sigma squared, where in this case, theta is equal to mu and sigma squared. Bracket theta alone means the unconditional probability or probability density of theta, which means we know the parameters of its distribution from previous studies or other sources. For example, bracket theta might be normal for the random variable theta with mean 50 and variance 4. So let's review the components of Bayes' theorem to understand where priors and likelihoods come in, because this is going to be really important to understanding why priors are so useful to us. So the posterior distribution, the distribution of the joint distribution, the conditional distribution of theta, conditional on the random variable Y, the random variable theta, conditional on Y, is the likelihood, the probability or probability density of the data conditional on theta, multiplied by the unconditional probability or probability density of theta, divided by the marginal distribution of the data. And what I want to do now is to simply go through each of these parts and relate the math to a graphical representation so we can better understand the role of priors. So there's a little bit of color coding here. I have the Bayes' theorem in the equation for Bayes' theorem in the upper part of the slide, and the mathematical component has the same color as the color in the graph. So the prior, bracket theta, can be either informative or vague. If it's vague, it's very, very, very flat. So it could take on a large number of values with equal probability. If it's informative, then it has some shape, there's some shape to it, so that some of the values of theta are far more probable than other values of theta. The likelihood is how we connect parameters to the data. The data Y are random variables before they're collected, but they're fixed and known after they're collected. And the likelihood allows us to answer, I would say, the most important question in science, and that is, what is the probability that I would observe the data that I have in hand conditional on the model with parameters theta being a faithful portrayal of the way the data arise. That's whether you're a likelihood or a Bayesian, that's how we connect data with parameters. So the observed likelihood is shown here in red. It's the way we connect data with parameters. And that portion of Bayes' theorem is identical to what we would use in maximum likelihood. So the shape of the observed likelihood are the same, whether it's in Bayesian inference or in maximum likelihood. So the product of those two components, the likelihood and the prior, is the joint distribution of the parameters in the data, shown here in blue, in the blue dashed line in the graph. It's simply multiplying each point on the prior times each point on the likelihood. The marginal distribution of the data, also known as the posterior predictive distribution, is the denominator in Bayes' theorem. It's the area under the joint distribution. By integrating out theta, we get the marginal distribution of the data alone, which is a distribution before the data are evaluated, before the data are collected. And because the data are known, it becomes a normalizing constant after the data are collected. So if we take each point in the joint distribution and we divide through by the area under that curve, the marginal distribution of the data, we get the posterior distribution, shown here in the line in royal blue. And notice, the important thing to notice is the posterior represents essentially a compromise between what we knew before we collected the data that we have in hand and the information that are in the data we have just collected. So it allows us to build in a very important way on previous studies that are relevant to the question that we seek to answer. It reflects our prior and our current knowledge about theta. So what are informative priors? Also called informed priors because they have numeric constants in their distributions. Informative priors are distributions that are not diffuse relative to the posteriors. So they contain information. They have some shape to them. And those distributions of informed priors can be based on statistics that are reported in the literature, which we'll talk about in a moment. They could be based on posterior distributions from previous studies, including pilot studies. They could be based on meta-analyses, which is something we're going to learn how to do. And they can be based on plausible assumptions about the domain of the parameter of interest. Why would we use them? They enhance our insight. They're more information that bear on the question at hand by combining information from multiple sources. They speed the convergence of MC-MC. They reduce problems of identifiability, sometimes allowing us to estimate parameters that would otherwise be unestimable without the use of priors. They may allow us to estimate quantities that would be impossible to estimate, to reiterate, when our priors do not contain information. So an important concept for the rest of this discussion is the idea of support. The support of the random variable z includes all of the values of z such that the probability or the probability density of z exceeds 0. So I like to think of it, where does the parameter live? And I'll give you some examples in just a moment. But don't confuse this definition of support with the concept of support from maximum likelihood, which is entirely different. We're going to use the support broadly to mean all of the values of z for which the probability or probability density exceed 0. So here's some examples. Let's say we have counts of occupied sites out of a total counts of occupied sites. So the likelihood could be binomial or Bernoulli. If we had 0, 1 data for sites, it would be Bernoulli. If we had summed over the number of occupied sites, it would be binomial. In either case, the parameter that we're interested in is the probability of occupancy. Well, if it's a probability, then the support of the parameter is between 0 and 1, and that support dictates that the distribution for the prior must be beta. Let's take another example, species richness. The likelihood for species richness data is going to be either Poisson or negative binomial because these are counts. The parameter that we seek to estimate is the mean of the Poisson or the negative binomial, and that's continuous on 0 to positive infinity. So we need a distribution for the prior that has that support, and a gamma distribution or a log normal would be appropriate. Above ground net primary production, the likelihood could be gamma or log normal. It's continuous and it's strictly positive. We can't have negative primary production. The parameter we seek to estimate is a mean. It's continuous. The mean is the support for the parameter is continuous on 0 to positive infinity. And so we would use a gamma or a log normal a distribution for that prior. And there are some other examples. Regression coefficients. The likelihood for the data in a regression model may be normal, and we're seeking to estimate the mean of the regression coefficients. That can be continuous on minus infinity to plus infinity, and the distribution for the prior is usually normal. So what do we, if we're wanting to compose a prior distribution with the proper support, then, and we want to do it based on values that we get from the literature, this may present somewhat of a problem. And I want to show you how to solve that problem. Here's some tabulated data from a papers of ours on modeling brucellosis in the Yellowstone bison population. And we've got a series of parameters, almost all of which, all of beta, all but beta and sigma squared p are proportions, they're probabilities. So F sub n is the number of juveniles recruited per susceptible female. F sub p is the number of juveniles recruited per recovered adult female. So these all range between 0 and 1. Here's the problem. All distributions have got parameters. So what we have here is the random variable z, the distribution of the random variable z conditions on alpha and beta. So alpha and beta are parameters of the distribution of the random variable z. And there are all kinds of parameters: intensity, centrality, and location. Set the position on the x-axis of various distribution shape, controls distribution and skew, scale, dispersion parameter, rate, shrinks or expands. The width, rate is the reciprocal of scale. So the problem is, how do we find parameters using tabulated means and standard deviations if those are not the same as parameters of, say, the beta distribution or the gamma distribution or the log normal? The normal and the Poisson are the only distributions for which the parameters of the distribution are the same as those tabulated means and variances or standard deviations. The parameters of all other distributions are functions of the mean and the variance. How do we find those parameters given the published values of means and variances? And that's the topic of the next video, which will entitle Moment Matching. The take home from this video is that prior distributions are powerful tools for synthesizing results from ecological studies. Using them reliably requires choosing or finding parameters for distribution based on published means and standard errors. Well,